It is now 1 p.m. Geneva time. We are officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx or is now watching the recording of this event. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for the launch of a new series of events co-organized by the Geneva Environment Network and the ad hoc open-end working group on a science policy panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention, as a follow-up of their first session that resumed in Thailand earlier this year. In the lead-up to the establishment of a science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, the series of webinars and events that we are launching today aims at building bridges and promote collaboration and knowledge sharing between and among stakeholders and to raise public awareness about the ad hoc open-end working group, preparing proposals for the establishment of the panel. Ms. Goody Alkemade, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Netherlands to the United Nations Environment Programme and Chair of the ad hoc open-end working group, will formally welcome you to this event and the launch of this series. The session will be moderated by Ms. Jacqueline Alvarez, the Chief of the United Nations Environment Programme Chemicals and Health Branch. And before I hand over to them, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available on the webpage of this event. The link is being shared in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. We have a dedicated session to answer these after the presentations. Finally, let me also add that the transcription is available at the bottom left of your screen. Have a look at the current slide, which shows where to access automated transcripts in over 100 languages. With that, I have the pleasure to turn to Ms. Goody Alkemade for her welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much. Sorry for the delay of getting everything working. Yes, so my name is Goody Alkemade. As was mentioned, I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative for the Netherlands to UNEP since 2019. And I was also the focal point to UNEP from the Ministry of Environment in my country since 2014. So I have been able to follow the work of UNEP for quite some time. As I facilitated in my capacity as Deputy Permanent Representative, the negotiations that led to the resolution that is the basis for our work to work towards the establishment of the panel. I offered my availability to also facilitate the resulting process. And it's an honor for me to be elected as chair of the open-ended working group and to serve all member states, all stakeholders as they wish and as it may suit. As highlighted, this is the first in a series of webinars to inform member states and stakeholders on important elements of the work ahead and that we need to deliver at the end of this process. This was also discussed yesterday in the Bureau, and we hope that these webinars and also maybe some of the side events will serve as a basis for written submissions by member states and stakeholders and also to inform informal consultations that may inform our discussions in the next session and possibly also the third session. This webinar on operating principles, we believe, given the discussions that we had in the first session where we discussed on substantive issues, including on the scope and objective of the panel, will help to further inform those discussions as we get back in the next session. I hope that this webinar will enhance a common understanding of what the operating principles should be, what they are, and what should be addressed in them, as well as on how they could be addressed. Rest me to wish everyone a fruitful, informative webinar, and looking forward to be at your service. Thank you.
Very much, Goody, for the overview on the process and for, in a way, being our leader in this process towards getting the panel advanced and established, hopefully early next year. So, if Diana, if I ask you to go to the presentation, please. And while you are doing so, I will start by again highlighting that today this webinar is intended to provide a snapshot, a very quick idea and understanding of the look and feel of operating principles. Operating principles that is a direct response to the request that we have received in UNEP as the Open-Ended Working Group Secretariat to prepare for further discussions end of this year in Jordan. So during this webinar, you will also see how things are interconnected. And though we are today going to focus on operating principles, they cannot be seen as a standalone process or document that will be revised. They need to fit into the bigger picture, which is this new panel that will be part of the discussion. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Yes. So when we are looking or thinking about operating principles, maybe not everybody or everyone is on the same page and on the same level of understanding. But when drafting them, there are some considerations which are really important to have in mind. And this is, for example, to consider how they may shape the long-term flexibility of the panel work, the institutional arrangements that might be related and coming as a consequence of the operating principles, the form follows function, concepts and ideas, the rules, the priority setting schemes or criteria that might also be part of it. So as I was highlighting, operating principles are very important building block to ensure the relevance of the work over time in a transparent manner, providing an enabling platform to discuss, generate knowledge, digest things, marinate, but also the uptake that are, and it's very important afterwards. So, but what are operating principles? Why do we need them? So before going into trying to answer with some examples of other panels, I'd like to reflect and really underscore that there is no one-size-fits-all proposal in here. We are creating a new panel, which means also that we can learn from the past, but we also have the possibility to really shape the future. So going through the principles of existing panels, and in general, as a very high-level statement, all of them, of course, are valid. All panels follow common principles that are, in a way, targeting the credibility, the relevance, the salience, the legitimacy, the transparency of the work. In other words, it's also how detailed and explicitly they are presented. You will see also variations, and there are other maybe different words with similar meanings being included. So the inclusion of operating principles among the different science policy panels is also, or can also be seen as a means of recognizing an agreement on overarching priorities, on characteristics, on values that will shape for sure the panel's outputs and deliverables. If you can go please to the next slide. So today we will navigate into a learning journey, particularly to learn and hear the hiccups, the best practices as well, from recognized speakers that you saw when Diana was introducing who is going to be with us today. As a matter of practice, the science policy panels define operating principles according to different things, the to-do and the not to-do things. There is a background document that has been also shared with you. You will benefit from the different things that it explains in a very simple manner, but highlighting the commonalities. And in this learning journey of today's webinar, you will hear from our colleagues, chairs, vice chairs of the IPCC, the IPBES, the International Resource Panels, and the Global Environment Outlook processes. Please, if you can go to the next slide. And this one, I can see immediately your reaction, even though I am not seeing you, and the expectations are, of course, not for you to read this. But it is important to highlight that in the climate arena, the Science Policy Panel in Climate adopted the first IPCC work plan in 1998, a lot of lessons from their side. And it was amended in 2012, but it lasted several years, meaning that they were strong enough to guide the work of the panel. They were adopted by the panel itself in 1998, at the moment that the work plan was adopted. This is a two-page document that lays out the principles that are connected to the rules governing the IPCC work. The basic elements, as I was mentioning before, the operating principles are one piece of the puzzle, it's one building block in the whole setup that we are, and that we need to in a way, further define and adopt. If you can go to the next slide. So talking about biodiversity and its panel. So there are 11 items included in a document that IPBES has produced, which is called Functions, Operating Principles and Institutional Arrangements of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This document was adopted in 2012 by the plenary itself as well. And in this session was when the panel was formally established, the IPBES was formally established. So 11 concise elements, as I was highlighting, and you can see in the drawing of this slide, the lines, the red lines, where they are highlighted. So it's section 2 under this document for your nightmares and to read about them strongly afterwards. Next slide. So here, what we are highlighting is the guiding principles that are part of the policies and procedures of the International Resource Panel. This document was adopted 2016. So what I'm really sharing with you are those processes at this stage and so far that already have gained a lot of experience and a lot of exposure, and where we might learn a lot of lessons. So in here, they have a list of 5 terms, each followed by a brief elaboration of what they mean. Next slide, please. This one is the GEO. The GEO is the Global Environment Outlook, and it also has operational principles defined. And in this case, it has very short life. They were adopted in September 2022 after a resolution by our governing body, the United Nations Environment Assembly, where there was a request to really further elaborate concepts about how to deal with the Global Environment Facility to reflect objectives, core functions of the process, and being more effective in the way that things are prepared and the uptake afterwards. So next slide. Learning from previous experiences, a comparison. And here it's not the objective of comparing, as you know, but it's just to highlight those elements that are common to everyone. So you will see that each approach has successfully supported its panel. And I hope that's the conclusion of the speakers that will go after me as well. There are reviews that show that many principles are common across the panels, and you will see also there the credibility, the relevance, the salience, the legitimacy that are in a way the objectives of those principles. There are some words that might not be the same as I was highlighting before. There are some things that can be explicitly indicated and taken up, and there are other things that are part of the whole group of documents that make the panel something living. And when we were working on these documents, we also tried to have some illustrative examples of what we are examining. And if you bring me to the next slide, here is this policy relevant and not policy prescriptive aspects. Some things are already pre-established in the UNEA resolution, the resolution 5.8 that was adopted 1 year ago. And it talks about to deliver policy relevant scientific evidence without being policy prescriptive. So showing the variety of possibilities and options that are really important to change the behavior, to modify certain aspects, or to better understand the status and where we are, the state of knowledge in certain areas. If you see the policy relevant but not policy prescriptive aspects, it's already reflected in the IPCC, also in the IPBES, in the IRP, and in the GEO process. But maybe in the GEO process, it's talking about the relevance in general, responding in a flexible manner to needs that member states, in our case, or other stakeholders that might need. As this is an essential also feature that the UNEA resolution and the member states were targeting, so that the policy uptake can be done in different levels, at the government level, but also in those enterprises, in those consumers, in the people that can really be the agents of change. The examples number 2 that I will share with you, and that's the next slide, talks about inclusivity and the balance of representation, leaving no one behind. And that it's including indigenous peoples, geographical regions, gender balance, interdisciplinary activities, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholders, and again, this is an aspect that you will see it's repeated in the other panels that I have been highlighting today for you. The next slide is another example talking about integrity, independence, objectivity, lack of bias, conflict of interest, and in here, maybe what I would like to highlight is that only the IRP principles document explicitly calls out the issue of conflict of interest. But you will see in the next slides that that is a special request from the open-ended working group meeting and participants that discussed and negotiated in Bangkok 2 months ago those elements that are critical for the future panel, and in a way setting in black and white the type of documents and the type of concepts that will need to be adopted by the international conference. There are the common ground, independence, objectivity, unbiased, integrity of the scientific processes. That is extremely important in the whole mixture and melange of things. If you please go, Diana, to the next slide, and I am almost getting into those areas where the UNEA resolution has highlighted. I will not go into details here, but maybe what I would like to to reflect is in the cross-cutting themes. The first three, credibility, relevance, and legitimacy, are in a way core to anyone. The cross-cutting themes, the transparency, of course, essential, the flexibility, essential, but there was a concrete request about coordination without duplication or complementarity with others and the works of others, including the MEAs. And here, maybe as a point of reflection, one of the things is alignment in the work plans. Sometimes we have to really assess where we are and how we can better work together independently of the topic that we are addressing. But what are those areas where the Science Policy Panel might be able to provide expertise vis-a-vis the work that is being done by others? And of course, this needs to be cost effective. So that is essential to make decisions with enough information that can allow us to move the agenda forward. Next slide. Other concepts, and this meeting in Bangkok in Thailand 2 months ago that I was referring before included a concept that might be potentially included in the principles of the panel, which is the promotion of innovation. And here it's very, very interesting because this is a topic that still is in baby steps. There are many, many opportunities. In reality, we lack scientific statistics or data on the uptake of those things. There are a lot of examples, a lot of good practices, many, many principles around what sustainable and green innovation might mean, but it might be also very important to reflect in this context of a science policy panel. Consensus-based, that's also part of the spirit always of the international governance discussions, where the decisions need to really happen in a concerted manner and in a way moving the agenda from the status quo and the minimum common denominator, but not leaving anyone behind. And of course, if the data, the results, the assessments, the strategies are not accessible, it will probably not have the impact that we are looking to have. Next slide. And this is my last one, going into the process. So you heard Guri explaining that yesterday in the Bureau, there were some discussions about the different steps to move the different building blocks forward in this agenda. And in the case of the operating principles, there is a specific process that it's outlined here, which starts with this webinar in a way, with an overview of those things, the commonalities. We will listen to the experts with the different experience in the different agendas. But we already have a background document that you can have a look. So in reality, this is not the first step. There is already some previous work in relation to this. Then, of course, that paper, we want your comments, your submissions, your inputs, and you will receive an official communication, member states and focal points to this process, including other stakeholders, not only at the government level. And we are kindly requesting your submissions to come not later than 6th of June this year, which is the day after the Environment Day. So you can enjoy that day, but the day after, please ensure that your inputs are coming to us. And last, for the preparations of the open-ended working group, because the meeting is expected to happen in Jordan in December, and the documentation needs to enter pipelines, data time frames, sorry, that includes several steps. With this, I'll, and the last slide, the next slide, with a big thank you. I'd like to move now to the next speaker for us today. And I invite Co Barrett, the Vice Chair of the IPCC, to please stand here with us. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Hello, all, and thank you for inviting the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to provide some of our perspectives on operating principles. For those who are not familiar, the IPCC has been in existence for over 30 years, and our core action is to provide periodic assessments of the state of climate knowledge. We put out our assessment products about every 7 years, and we're now just finishing up our 6th assessment cycle. IPCC has employed a number of procedures, as you saw in one of the slides, but I really want to focus on just 3 of our core principles that really drive the way we do our work. And the first is Jacqueline kind of provided, but it's so key to the work that we do, is to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And so in our case, that means making sure to assess the science that is so key to underpinning solid policy decisions, but not to do so in a way that actually criticizes or even evaluates the specific policies of regions or countries. It's an interesting evolution that's gone on in IPCC, because as we move towards stronger climate action, policymakers have been asking us to assess the feasibility of some of these actions. So we do so, and that's actually become an important part of our recent assessments, but we never do it in the context of what an individual policymaker or country, is employing. And that's key, right? Because we need to maintain always our scientific integrity and an unbiased approach. The second operating principle I'd like to share is the important role that broad review and consultation plays in leading to consensus support for our key summary findings. During the production of our assessment reports, we have various reviews. Some of them engage scientists and experts. Other reviews are geared specifically to governments. I mean, the intergovernmental part of IPCC is something we take very seriously. But we find that this broad review of our draft reports helps us to check biases that we as scientists may have, but also to write the reports in ways that are more accessible to, say, a non-science reader. And it helps also to start to build broad support for our summary findings, which we negotiate with governments word for word in our summaries. And I think there's the power of IPCC reports, is that we then have consensus between policymakers and science on our key findings. And then the third operating principle that I'll share, and again, one that was highlighted in the previous slides, is the importance of diversity and inclusion for our process. IPCC assessments are global assessments of the state of knowledge for climate. And as such, we need to be inclusive in the scientists that we engage in authorship. So we're very, very keen to reach equity in terms of gender, in terms of bringing in scientists from the global south. And we find that this inclusive approach actually helps to make our assessments much more broadly useful. It helps us to check cultural biases that may, be introduced by having too narrow a group of scientists, but it also helps to broadly educate the world on the importance of these findings. And as we go along, just taking gender as an example, when we first did the first assessment report in the late 80s, we had about 3% women, part of our authorship team. And now we're not at 50%, but we are over 30% in the number of women scientists that we engage in our process. We only grow stronger, and the reports only become more robust with the inclusion of a broad range of scientists and stakeholders. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jacqueline.
Thank you very, very much, Ko. And maybe I will highlight one of the words that you mentioned, which is the power of the IPCC. And that is one of the things that we always look to have in the chemicals and waste agenda, that power to mobilize the different groups, the different agendas, and the level of ambition. So thank you very much for being with us today. Now I'm moving to Mara Biana. She is co-chair of the Multidisciplinary Expert Scientific Advisory Group, MESAC, of the GEO. Please, Mar, if you can put your camera on. And
hello, can you see it now? Okay.
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. There are my slides. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for inviting the Global Environment Outlook to be part of this webinar. So yes, if we could move on to the next slide, please. I will present briefly some of the operating principles of GEO as well, and some facts and how it works and in terms of actors and roles. So we can move to the next slide, please. As you might know, GEO sources from the UNEA, a mandate from the UNEA Resolution 5.3, which has an objective to keep the world environment situation under review, to inform and support action. Basically, it means to be active while strengthening the science policy interface of UNEP. And this should be done by through an intergovernmental expert-led assessment produced every 4 years, which is the GEO, the Global Environment Outlook. Next slide, please. So there are 3 points, 3 key points about GEO. First, it is UNEP's flagship intergovernmental and expert-led environmental assessment, which is viewed by member states as a foundation of UNEP's science policy interface, and has been discussed already in by the previous presenters. GEO shares a set of operating principles which are common to several of the other major assessments, because it builds on them, because it builds on the best practices and the experience from previous assessments. So GEO has as main operating principles that it must be politically legitimate, policy relevant, and scientifically credible, which is what we have key principles that we have already heard. This means that GEO, for example, should underpin UNEA's decisions in terms of and support major global policy decisions, for example. And it should also, GEO is also designed to be, it's an intergovernmental assessment, but it's rather flexible, and it can support policy assessments. This is demonstrated, if you can move on in the slide, please, by, there we go, also next, by the chapters in GEO 6, which were devoted to assessment of the current environmental policy, or in target-led, target-directed strategies in the outlooks section. So next slide, please. As we know, a successful assessment is based on legitimacy, saliency, and credibility. So these are also pillars of GEO. In terms of saliency and legitimacy, well, GEO has already a long history of 25 years, and it is strongly supported by stakeholders. It is a demand-driven process. This is also a relevant or key pillar, which aims to produce findings which keep the target user in focus always, to make sure that the findings are always useful and can be produced in a language that can be taken up by its audience. And in terms of scientific credibility, this is supported by a rigorous scientific process based on a number of aspects, but especially also, as described for IPCC, the robustness of the review process, and also on the balance in terms of expertise, gender, and geography of all the drafting teams. Next slide, please. So one of the key strengths of GEO is that it builds on a large group of diverse and multidisciplinary experts external to UNEP, and they build a process of collaboration and co-creation. At the center of this process is the executive director, as you can see here in the slide. And on the left-hand side, you can see the 2 main advisory bodies that support the executive director: the Intergovernmental and Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, the IMAC, and the Multidisciplinary Expert Scientific Advisory Group, the MESAC. You can see in the graph how both advisory groups are perfectly balanced in relation to their connection with their executive director, but also the connection between themselves. And this is how in GEO the scientific credibility and the policy relevance are supported, are ensured. On the right-hand side of the graph, we can see the experts, the authors, and the drafting teams who are supported and coordinated by the co-chairs and the vice chairs of the assessment. And all of this is supported by a group of experts from UNEP Secretariat and from the Office of the Executive Director. Next slide, please. And now moving to the GEO7 procedures document. This was a document which was approved in September 2022 at an ad hoc open-ended meeting, which included experts, member states, and representatives from the stakeholder groups. This procedures document that we have seen already in one of the previous presentations. I won't go into all the details, but basically it contains these operating principles that have already been described. It discusses the consistency and comparability across GEOs, of course, but also how to ensure the relevance of the findings, the legitimacy as a demand-driven process, also the balance in the teams in terms of expertise, gender, and geography to ensure scientific credibility. And then it also goes a bit further in the next slide to provide clarifications on more specific issues such as definition and terminology, even on clearance processes, governance structures, and this kind of more of a running the process details. And just to finalize, before I go to my last slide, I would like to provide an example, as we were asked to make it a bit more tangible if possible. So in terms of the scientific credibility of the assessment, this would be one of the operating principles, the guiding principles. And this is developed further as procedural guidance in this procedures document in terms of specifying, for example, the review process, how this works, which is based on best practice from other assessments. But in GEO, it also defines, in GEO, it also defines in the procedures document the number of review rounds, how this is defined, how the authors are engaged in the review process, the review editors, the reviewers, the interactions between them. So this is the level of detail that then the procedural guidance provides. And this all helps in this case, the MESAC, ensure the scientific credibility of the process. And if I can go to my last slide, please. And I think this would be all from my side. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mar. And demand-driven process, that's essential for the uptake. I completely agree. And I'm very happy that you highlighted that aspect as well as the co-creation. So we will be having questions and answers afterwards, not after each presentation. So please stay with us for a little longer. I am now looking at Hala Razian. Hala, you will be talking and sharing with us on the IRP, International Resource Panel, another very important policy, science policy process that have shown a lot of uptake by stakeholders over the years. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and hello everybody from Paris this afternoon. I'm here, as Jacqueline said, on behalf of the International Resource Panel. My name is Hala Razian. On the next slide, I will just talk to you a little bit about who the IRP is, in case you are not familiar with us too much. And then as other speakers walk through some of our guiding principles and how they are operationalized at the IRP, and really how they form the center of almost everything that we do in terms of the guidance they provide for us. So you have heard from our big sisters already today, IPCC and IPBES. And we like to introduce them when we introduce ourselves, because we perform the same science policy function, except for two key differences. The first is that our focus is on resources, and that means fossil fuels, metals, minerals, biomass, water, how these items are used, produced, consumed in the global economy, what the impact of that process is on people and planet. And with the help of our steering committee, we try to identify policy relevant recommendations to change the way resources are used in the global economy for the benefit of people and planet. On the next slide, you will see why we focus on resources, in that its use has been growing at an alarming rate, and that its impact affects biodiversity and climate in ways that are fundamental. And this brings me to the second key difference of our panel, which is that we actually do not feed directly into a convention, as our previous speakers do, but rather we aim to bring the science of the IRP about resources to the relevant intergovernmental bodies, including the UNFCCC, the CBD, the HLPF, and others. On the next slide, you will see what has already been shared as our policies and procedures document, adopted in 2016 by our steering committee. And this document kind of guides all that we do. The steering committee has the approval authority over any amendments thereof, while the Secretariat, of which I am a part of, is responsible for the day-to-day operationalization of those principles, which you see the objective and guiding principles lumped together right at the front and center of our policies and procedures under our first section. The next two slides actually draw out a little bit more of our objective, which I've talked about and I won't go into, but I wanted to highlight on this slide and the next how our guiding principles are already integrated into our objectives. So you see that we have on this page science-based as one of the key measures of our objective. On the next slide, you will find independence, a focus on equity, more about policy relevance and informing key stakeholders. And you will see on the next slide that those words are reflected and resonate across our 5 guiding principles in our policies document, which is policy relevance, independence, inclusiveness, objectivity, and integrity. And I will touch on each of those quite quickly and give a couple of examples how they're operationalized. So to begin with, on policy relevance, the way on the next slide, you will see how that is operationalized, and I will let you read for yourselves the description of that guidance. The way it's operationalized in practice is actually safeguarded mainly by our steering committee. They are the body which approves and has approving power over our program of work. They request new study topics and approve requests from other members. And when it comes to our actual scientific products, they are an integral part of the review process, where they look at whether the scientists are presenting things of policy relevance and provide input and recommendation to those products. So policy relevance really driving the role of our steering committee. On the next slide, you'll see just some examples of how our work has ended up impacting different national, global, and industry actors. And I won't stay here long, but just to say that we rely heavily on our steering committee to access and influence these different bodies. The next slide has our second principle, which is independence. And here on the other side of the coin, we rely heavily actually on our panel members to secure our independence. So our panel members are nominated by a group of expert reviewers, an independent group, to serve for a term of 4 years, renewable up to a maximum of 2 terms. And they are not remunerated. They work for us pro bono, and they do not represent any organization or country. They work in their individual capacity. And these terms of a panel member help to ensure our independence, as well as one of the key strengths of the IRP is that actually the final approval to publish any scientific study rests in the hands of our panel scientific members. So they approve work to go to peer review, and they approve work for final publication. Another way we have ensured our independence through our policies is in the way our funding structure works, whereby private funding can never exceed the amount of money we receive from public funds. And that's one way that we ensure our integrity and independence. The next slide I will skip and go straight to our third principle, which is inclusiveness. And I think this is one of the most important of our guiding principles, but also has been one of the most difficult to put in practice for us, because these principles were put in place in 2016, several years after our panel has already been active and producing work and recruiting members, both from the scientific and steering committee side. So when this principle of inclusiveness was put in place, we were already starting, unfortunately, at a bit of a disbalance, where we had many of our scientists who were men from the Global North, and our steering committee membership mainly reflects the Global North. But we have been working to really improve that balance moving forward. There are some ways that diversification is reflected in our policies. So in terms of how whether you are required to financially contribute to the panel if you're a steering committee member from the OECD states or not. For panel scientists, although they work pro bono, we do cover certain expenses that they may incur in the process of their work. And our panel co-chairs are split between a developed and developing country, and often also along the lines of gender. However, you will see on the next slide that this is still a work in progress for us. And here I think is a great opportunity for this new science policy panel to start on the right footing, perhaps by suggesting already quotas that you may wish to follow in nominating your scientists or otherwise, which is an approach that the IRP has considered in the past. On the next slide is our fourth principle, objectivity. And here, I think as standard with the other panels is that we undertake an expert review, and again, that our scientists have the final approval of our work. And finally, the last principle on the next slide, integrity. Here, as Jacqueline mentioned, apparently the IRP is one of the few to explicitly reference conflict disclosures, conflict of interest disclosures, as part of the mandate for our scientists. And we also draw on the support of the Inter-Academy Council in case there is any scientific dispute that we are unable to resolve through the normal functioning of our panel to support us. So I hope by this very quick nutshell of our guiding policies that you see how they are actually very essential to our operations and what we do. And thank you again for this opportunity, and ready for any questions you might have. Thank you, Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hala. And I really will be very, very interested in following up with you on how to operationalize the things. That is one of the biggest challenges we have seen and observed. Always, the scientific data can be available, might be available, but at the end, how to make that work, how to make efficient legislation with that, how to make efficient decisions from the different perspectives, how to change a technology, how to do innovation, is the thing that we are always stuck. It's not only by presenting, but how we tackle with the things. And that's one of the discussions that is of extreme relevance. So thank you very much for highlighting that aspect. Eduardo Brandisio, co-chair of the Global Assessment of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services First of all, congratulations for the GBF and all the inputs that you provided for that to happen. Welcome here with us today as well, and thank you for joining earlier. For you, we appreciate that effort. So over to you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Can you hear me well? Thank you.
Yes, very well.
Yeah, I only have 2 slides, which basically outlines the 11 principles that we use at IPBES, but I would like to contextualize them and talk a little bit about how they actually play out in an assessment, which was the global assessment report that I could share. First of all, congratulations on doing a consultation like that and look at multiple experiences to see what we have learned and where we are going based on the support that guiding principles provide. So IPBES today has 140 countries as members. It was formed in 2012 after several years of negotiations of the parts. And I think that's an important part of how the guiding principles developed. IPBES was very much already building on the work of the Convention of Biological Diversity, which has since the early 1990s developed a convention that also aimed to be inclusive and representative of all the aspects that are related to biodiversity research. So many of the things that came up and are part of the guiding principles of IPBES benefited from 20 years of development within the CBD and later the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And this includes, for instance, the inclusion of indigenous and local knowledge, to have representation from different regions and different stakeholders, to have inclusive knowledge systems as part of the assessment, and so forth. So what I want to say here is that there's a process that led to a negotiation and then 4 years of negotiations among countries in which countries of the Global South had very strong voice in developing these principles. So when they came about and when they were formalized with IPBES in 2012, they were largely shared by those members of the platforms and all of those, all the experts and stakeholders that participated in that process. So that aspect of having a shared understanding and a shared commitment to those principles made all of the difference in the way that they became operationalized. And I can say that perspective of an assessment like the global assessment. I think the 11 principles, the first 6 that are here, and the remaining 5 principles that you see in a second, each one of them had a contribution to the global assessment. Now, I'll hit to some of those elements as you see them in these slides. The first aspect that they played an important role was in the scoping process of an assessment. Scoping is a very central process to set an assessment in the right footing. And those principles start to play out in those assessments. For instance, how do you bring together different teams, right, to represent the principles that are here and the values that are here? That is, considering international processes that have already done work that overlaps with an assessment, the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary nature of the team, seeking balance in gender, region, indigenous people and local communities. And so all that part were key to set on the scoping process that were already reflecting different voices and different perspectives, but also set the questions that would follow the principles and the points and values in the guiding principles. So questions, for instance, that would be inclusive of the perspective of indigenous peoples and local communities to biodiversity. Or questions that were sensitive to look at regional and interregional variation of the process that we're looking for. So starting from the scoping process, we see the designing principles provide a common platform and a shared understanding of what are the values and what are the priorities for the platform. The second aspect that it plays a key role is in the operationalization of an assessment. So an assessment like the global assessment and other IPBES assessment, they are by nature multidisciplinary and aimed at being inclusive. So this is really key when you form the assessment team, right? So you're looking for people who are representative of the the elements that we see in the principles, that takes into account existing assessment, and so the preparation of the team for an assessment itself reflects part of the assessment. It also reflects the challenges that we face when we have principles, right, that we're still sort of developing towards them. So for instance, it is very hard to keep and to find the balance that would be ideal for an assessment as defined by the principles. But we are in a process of improving towards meeting that goal. So setting that principle actually force us to really look hard and to bring a team that represents what we want to represent in terms of diversity, inclusion, region, expertise, and so forth. So operationalizing is key. The other aspect that is really important to make and to realize some of those principles is that you have the conceptual tools that are understood by those participating in an assessment, and of course by all involved in an assessment process, that provide support for us to take those principles forward. So in this case, and I should have added an image here, but the IPBES has a platform, a conceptual framework that defines how the platform sees the relationship between nature's contributions to people, and human well-being, right? Which are the sort of the three foundational aspects of the assessment, this relationship in which we look and use as a framework to look at the different analyses that we do. So it's not only having the principles, but having a shared understanding of them, having the conceptual tools that allow you to operationalize them and to recognize them. So for instance, the conceptual framework recognizes that there are different knowledge systems and different worldviews and ways of thinking about nature, about nature's contributions, and about human well-being. So, and that is part of the conceptual framework that is recognized in the conceptual framework that has been approved by the entire plenary. So it offers a shared vision and a shared understanding in which each expert can see oneself there contributing to a particular area, but as part of a larger picture, and also understanding that there are different and complementary knowledges and approaches to any given aspect of the conceptual framework and of the assessments that we do. So those shared tools, like a conceptual framework, analytical tools that translate those guiding principles into operational principles that we can use on a day-to-day basis, and sort of mediate and create bridges for discussions of experts that may have come from different fields. Another part of importance of the operating principles is the inclusivity of knowledge systems in IPBES, which I think is very particularly innovative for the platform to include and be transparent about, of course, peer review research, but also a broad array of scientific in literature, for instance, in reports and great literature, and also consider indigenous and local knowledge, and therefore developing approaches to bring those together, to complement each other, right, and to make an assessment stronger. For that, we need tools, and we need, of course, respect and understanding that they can work together. The third aspect that I would say is really key, that the operating principles play a key role, is in the process of crafting and negotiating an assessment, if you will. So in the crafting different chapters, unpacking the questions of the scoping document and crafting that, those principles give authors sort of both the right and also a concern with making sure that when you unpack and prepare a chapter for an assessment, you are considering those different principles right? And making sure that they are included in the assessment. So respect for different disciplines, respect for different knowledge system becomes part of the process of developing and crafting an assessment. The other aspect is that we have, in order to fulfill these principles and to fulfill those goals, you end up, being very proactive in planning consultations and collaborations throughout the process and making sure that you have a transparent and participatory process where you hear, you listen, you share, right, and learn from in a co-production process from all sorts of stakeholders, member states, participants, and interest groups. And that reflects then on the writing of the assessment, and then how we translate that into a language that is policy relevant, that is inclusive, that reflects different and understandings, but also represent a shared document of the platform. So these are elements in which, I can say that in the global assessment, each one of the 11 principles were key to support the development of the assessment and contribute to, its success at the end. Now, the other aspect that I would say is that when you have principles like that, and I believe Jacqueline mentioned that at the very beginning, this is always a work in progress, right? For many of these principles, these are aspirations that we do not necessarily have yet or have the conditions to fulfill. So it depends on a continuous process of working. I'll give an example, for instance, which is inclusion, right? So that's an important priority, an important goal for IPBES. And the platform has been exemplary, I think, in making every aspect of its work program very inclusive, but it's always a work in progress. It's always a process of identifying more collaborators from different regions, having a strong capacity building program, right, that bring a new generation to contribute, and with sort of that share this the values reflected in those principles. And capacity building, for instance, became an important part of the assessment process. Increasing representation, it's always a work in progress, and also improving the analytical tools, the mechanisms in which we operationalize these principles into an assessment. So it's always a work in progress. It provides an umbrella and a roadmap that really brings very diverse set of authors together. In the case of the global assessment, about 135 nominated experts, but with contributing authors, we had around 450. So the principles and the tools and the conceptual frameworks that we have in an umbrella for all of us really allow us to bring our best and contribute to each other within this very challenging and diverse test that we have when we do an assessment. So I'll stop here and looking forward to more conversation with the group. Thank you.
Yes, obrigada, Eduardo. Thank you very much for this. And for me, one of my take-home messages from you, besides the richness of what you were saying, is the issue of shared understanding. And that's always a challenge because everybody creates expectations based on their understandings. And then the bridge can really not be made because the gap in the middle is very, very big. So thank you for highlighting that. And the second element is the place to go aspects, the conceptual framework, the principles that are there, and the experience as well. So thank you very, very much for that. So I would kindly ask you all, if possible, if your bandwidth allow, to turn on your cameras, please, so that when we come into this session of questions and answers, you can raise your hand in case you think the question can go to you. So I will maybe start with a reflection that came from Emmanuel to Ko's presentation. And what he is saying is that he appreciates the presentation very much because the mentioning of various stakeholders, periodic assessments, and dissemination of information, even to non-scientists, great to this level. However, I think the importance of NGOs wasn't mentioned. We know they do a lot of awareness and advocacy and capacity building. So may I ask, what specific roles do the NGOs play for effectiveness? So this is a very specific questions to you, Ko. The other ones are more generic. So the ones that at least we have so far. So if you don't mind, I will ask you to maybe take this one first, please.
Yeah, happy to do so. And great question. I should have highlighted the diversity of our stakeholders, including NGOs. They, of course, play an important role in helping to facilitate climate solutions around the world. In the case of IPCC, a number of NGOs are observers to our process, and as such, they participate in our approval sessions for the reports. And that, again, is a really important perspective to bring into the diversity of perspectives that we try to represent in our science. And, you know, I could have also mentioned the important role of Indigenous organizations and Indigenous knowledge in our reports. But thank you for asking that question. NGOs are indeed very key to the work that we do.
Thank you very much. Then the next thing in the chat is for the panelists, and it goes like this. Are there operating principles that any of you wish could be part of their panel current principles, but they are not there yet? So who would like to go first? Should there be any? Hard question. Okay, Ko, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably all have a principle like this, but I in the case of IPCC, I think it really needs to be strengthened. And that is the encouragement to member governments to really consider diversity when they are nominating people to the leadership team for IPCC and also scientists to our assessment processes. You know, we don't have a mandate for gender equity. We don't have a mandate for trying to find balance between global South and global North scientists. But in fact, we really need to strengthen our procedures with regard to increasing the diversity of our participants. I mean, the science shows, the research shows that bringing in the multitude of perspectives only strengthens our assessments. And so, you know, for that reason, I would say, you know, strengthened procedures to encourage a stronger balance would be helpful.
Eduardo, please.
Yeah, well, that's a really important one. We do have these mandates in the IPBES principles, so we do purposely look for that. I'm not sure that, you know, I agree the governments could do a better job in offering sort of a broader range of representation in their nominations. I don't feel any particular gap within the IPBES principles, but perhaps one that comes to mind, which is the participation of governments in reviewing documents and reviewing assessments. Sometimes and during some cycles of reviews, we have very limited participation of governments in the review process. So there are some governments that tend to, you know, really dedicate a lot of efforts to that. But yeah, and in some cycles, you know, it's way beyond the desirable. So a principle that, you know, sort of commits governments to be very involved during the whole process could be helpful as well.
Yes, yes, you are very right, both of you with this. And maybe you want to come in, please?
Yes, Jacqueline, just thinking about what others have said and building on that, what I really appreciate from the GEO process, for example, is their use of GEO fellows as a way to kind of uplift and engage maybe youth or scientists from different regions that might not have the opportunity. So I was thinking what's missing from the IRP is maybe this principle of, engagement or bringing everyone along, or, an active way of lifting up scientists from contexts where it's not as advantageous as the global north, for example.
Yes, please, Mar.
Actually, thank you. I was going to say that in your introductory presentation, I liked from the IRP actually that it encourages innovation, and especially from the point of view of communication of the findings of the GEO. GEO is already working on digitalization and finding ways to maximize the impact. But I think this is something that should be even more enhanced, and maybe this encouraging innovation in regard to how to communicate the findings and how to engage different types of communities, from stakeholders to the general public, to make effective the findings and the action proposed by these assessments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one question from a colleague from the chemicals agenda that is always very, very active. And he's asking all of you if you could comment on the boundary between policy relevant and policy prescriptive advices.
I hate to keep going first, but because this is such an important principle for the IPCC, I think the boundary has actually shifted for us over time, although it's always a firm line that we never cross. And as I mentioned in my comments, we've gone so far as to kind of now evaluate the feasibility of certain policy options, which is, something that policymakers have asked of us. Please, what is the science on whether these things are working or not? And so that's kind of, policy relevant. But of course, we don't say, is this policy working in X country? Which would be, I think, far, going over a line, certainly for IPCC. We need to maintain our unbiased approach to the science.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please, Hala.
I think for the IRP, one way we approach this, of course, we are not policy prescriptive, but we try to magnify our policy relevance by looking at our findings through a regional lens, dividing our findings based on the different income groupings that countries may find themselves in, so that, there is no one-size-fits-all recommendation that we could give. In any case, every country is different in context and capacity. So for us, that the way we increase our relevance is by trying as far as possible to address the wide range of options that could be available to countries, rather than prescribing a single modality.
Hala, now that I have you in the speaker, there is a particular question for you on the conflict of interest policy. And the question is if you can expand on the usefulness of including a conflict of interest policy or a process. And for the others, if it could be desirable to have it in this panel or in the context of the work that you are doing.
Certainly, thank you for that question. So in terms of a conflict of interest disclosure requirement, this has actually been quite useful, where, for example, in terms of undertaking peer review or excusing themselves from certain functions, our panel members have informed us that there might be a potential conflict, and that has only served to strengthen our scientific rigor. I have to say, as far as I have been with the panel, we have never had cause to use our conflict resolution mechanism that is stipulated in our procedures. We rely on consensus and open discussion and dialogue. So it's nice to know that we have this option. However, in practice, it has not been something that we have had to draw on.
Any other comments from? Yes, please, Mark.
In as far as I know, in the GEO, maybe this is not described as a principle as an operating principle, but we do have the members of the different bodies need to disclose or to sign a conflict of interest form, and we have procedural guidance regarding, for example, in the scientific advisory panel, if there's a conflict, if a member of the panel group wishes to become an author, so there's a conflict there, and we have mechanisms to move from one group of participant, like a drafting team, to the advisory bodies, or the other way around if this happens. So the mechanisms are in place as well in GEO.
Yes, and this is a very important observation, because sometimes they are not included as part of the operating principles, but the policy is in place and the process is in place to guarantee that. So thank you very much for highlighting this aspect. There is a question related to how do you overcome the problems when politics or government positions on an issue interfere with the science-based consensus reaching? Never ever, right?
Well, I would break this problem, I think, in terms of depending when, at what stage of the process you're talking about. I think when it's part of a review process, in a review that is open and disclosed, and you see that kind of input, it becomes part of the discussion, the negotiation, and involves more people, and I think is a healthy part of the process, because you have countries bring their perspective, but in a process that is transparent, in a process that is a review process. It's much more challenging when you get to a negotiating phase, right, where you have documents, you're negotiating, and then you have political perspectives playing out, in the findings of the document. It becomes much more complicated. And it has to be dealt, both at the expert level and at the political level. There's no way of separating the two when you are, in a plenary. But I think that's a symptom, of a process that perhaps there was not enough participation during its development. Because I think when there is very healthy participation during different stages of preparing a document, many of those differences become negotiated, become clear, or sort of tackled up front. The hard part is when those things come at the very last end, when you're kind of negotiating things. We had particular experiences negotiating, given a simple example, doing analysis of or categorizing countries in terms of, using a system of like the World Bank systems of, levels of income vis-a-vis using a UN system in terms of develop, least develop, and so forth, and organizing that as analytical categories to look, for instance, at the relationship between economic growth and protected areas. And then there's a request to change that because, where given countries are placed when you do an analysis of that kind. That's an interesting case where we had, for instance, in plenary to redo the analysis based on different categories, show in which way those different categories would influence the result, right? And then have a middle, sort of middle ground in which we would go forward, because we sort of brought the experts and the political negotiation together. Anyhow, but I think a good process should avoid the sort of surprise when you are at that later stage of an assessment.
Jacqueline, if I could just add from an IPCC perspective, Eduardo's comments really resonate. But, we always have a negotiation of our summaries, word for word, by countries. And the words matter to countries. And often the suggestions that we get from countries are really helpful to help us to maybe move away from scientific jargon to more understandable findings that just an average person could understand and act on. But in our case, the science always has the final word. So countries will, certainly negotiate the wording, but we always defer to scientists to make sure that the end product of a negotiation over words still retains its scientific integrity.
Yeah, good point.
Can I ask you a follow-up to that? Is that written? Is part of a practice? How do you do it? Because one big challenge that we might face is the dilution of the scientific evidence to get into the negotiated text and the minimum common denominator. So how is that? Is a question of being included somehow, or is a question on how things have evolved historically and the power, I will use back the words that you were saying, of the science?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's written in our case. I actually don't think it would be possible to write that in a way that was actionable, but certainly over time, this reliance on the science as the final arbiter has evolved to be a key way of doing our business. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes our scientific findings don't end up in our final assessment. Sometimes it's just impossible to find some wording that satisfies the countries, but it's pretty rare, honestly. Again, I'm just a strong believer in the consensus process, and having everyone feel that the end product represents something that everyone can support. So I don't know if I answered your question, Jacqueline, but certainly listening to countries, because these words end up, as others have said, our assessments support a whole negotiating process in the Framework Convention, Paris Agreement. So the words really matter to countries, and having a consensus far outweighs anything that may actually be potentially lost or kind of lose some strength in our end report.
Yes. So, for example, the Stockholm Convention, the subsidiary body, the POPROC, the POPs Review Committee, they have one area where in the text of the convention saying that any data or information that links directly with human health or environment deterioration is not subject to negotiation. It's not exactly the text, but in reality it's hinting that the relevance of that information is so high that it cannot be in a way diluted by the different vocabularies or sentences that we will be facing. I have a lot of questions for you. This is really very, very, very nice. And one of the questions that shocked me, and I hope we can send them to you maybe if you and afterwards, and if you can send us some bullets so that we can also put them in the Geneva Environment Network chat. But one of the questions, and I lost it. What is one thing that your groups started to do, but realized it was a bad idea and changed gears?
I can begin with that, because this is a practice that has evolved a little bit with our policies and procedures, where we used to only officially have full scientific assessments as the product that the IRP produces. And we were finding it very difficult to juggle ad hoc requests that might come in from different members, or, developing things on a shorter turnaround time to feed into specific forums on demand with that rigid format of full scientific assessments. So while we were developing our policies and procedures, we explicitly outlined the different types of products that the IRP produces, and different modalities of their approval and production process for each one, depending on how extensive the research is. So we have specific modalities for scientific assessments that should be completed within 1 year, which is a short turnaround, which are led by our co-chairs, for example, and each one has a different level of external review and approval. And that's something that we took based on our experiences previously operating with only full assessments as our outputs.
Thank you very much for that. Let me see. Are there any relevant principles or practices to safeguard commercially sensitive information in any panel? So anything that needs to be inserted or included in operating principles towards this aspect?
Well, one important, really important element for IPBES, because it's from the beginning having this principle and mandate to be inclusive of indigenous knowledge systems, is to be sensitive to the sensitivity of such knowledge or particular kinds of knowledge. So in addition to the principles that are the general principles that we're talking about, there are also a specific set of principles for working with indigenous and local knowledge and with knowledge holders. And these are equally important because they set the boundaries, of how to follow ethical procedures, free and prior informed consent, and evaluate, what kind of knowledge you should or should not include in an assessment. So yeah, that's a fundamental part, I think, of the platform, is to have the clear set of principles for working with, in particular, indigenous and local knowledge systems.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Eduardo, also that you were speaking just now, there is one element that maybe goes a little beyond operating principles, but it's part of the functions that the panel is discussing, and it is related to capacity building. And maybe if you can help shed some light on how you are addressing the capacity building aspects in the IPBES. It is of huge interest for many of the stakeholders to include the function within the chemicals waste and pollution prevention panel.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I would say perhaps divide it in a few words. One is building capacity, and the other capacity building, in the sense of that the way I see building capacity is that it involves everybody. Because when you part of your principle is to bring multidisciplinary teams and actually representatives from different sectors, and increasingly representatives of indigenous peoples, for instance, the capacity building involves everyone, right? It's being open to learn and to respect other kinds of knowledge, to work with a common framework, and to learn together how our particular piece of expertise fits within a larger framework that is guiding an assessment. So I think there's that larger capacity building aspect, which is part of the spirit, I think, that we expect that experts and others who join an assessment are ready, to be part of. So I think that's one sort of, it's a collective learning process, right? That, sort of enhances that shared understanding of why we're doing this. The second part of capacity building, I think, is bring a new generation, to be sort of, experienced in that. And one of the very successful aspects of IPBES is the Fellows Program. So it's a program that selects fellows and tend to also represent the other principles of international representation, gender ballot, expertise ballots, and so forth. And those fellows are put from the beginning of an assessment to work with the assessment team, and they're distributed across chapter, but they also have informed their own group. So in my experience, we had a group with at least a dozen to 15 fellows in the global assessment. It was one of the bright spots of the assessment. They were central to the chapters, but also, I mean, they took a much bigger experience out of it. I add a third part of capacity building, which is continue to enhance the functions of the program and some of the principles. So, for instance, there is an effort of a network of social science and humanities, right, to bring more people from that community to participate in the environmental assessment. And that's not a trivial task. We have a lot of social scientists there, and they're usually working independently of natural scientists and others. So that parallel process of creating networks, having conversation, learning the common lexicon, the common way of thinking, and challenging those two, that's also part of capacity building. So I'll think about capacity building in a very broad way as something that involves everybody in the assessment process.
No, thank you very much. And this is an essential. Yes, please.
Oh, so sorry. I wanted to add, because I think Hala touched on this in her presentation in a really effective way. We also have begun to use chapter scientists and are looking specifically to bring in scientists from Global South. In the past, when we've had a convening lead author from a developed country, they would bring in someone who works at their university, and we were finding an inequity in the number of chapter scientists, support scientists that we were having. So a real focus on bringing in these scientists from the Global South is really helping our processes. In the case of IPCC, we won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 and started a scholarship fund to produce PhD scientists from the Global South. And so we have now a pipeline of folks that we can bring in who have been supported through our scholarship fund to play the role of chapter scientist.
Thank you very much. These are elements as well for us to crack the nuts during this process, and our member states will need to make decisions also on how to, in a way, proceed with this. We are 1 minute over. There are maybe a lot of more questions. So what we are going to propose is that we will have a very short summary on questions and answers. And if you don't mind, we will revert to you, maybe if you can just clear them, but also in a way, let us know if there are any advices and suggestions from your side on the questions that you already discussed, but also in the other ones. I would like to ask Goody if she's still around, and I see her, she is. If maybe you want to switch on your camera and provide some closing remarks. Meanwhile, I remind all of you for the submission of the documents, 6th of June, it is very important to construct and to co-create using one of the words that were also mentioned during this webinar, and really make a powerful panel. So, Goody, sorry for the short notice. It would be very interesting to hear your closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. You caught me a bit by surprise, but I have been listening to the whole discussion, so lucky me. No, I would like to thank all the panelists, but also the audience for the really helpful questions. I think, the questions in particular helped also, I think, to raise a bit more the understanding and maybe also some of the challenges and the evolutions that were made in the different panels. I thought it was a very informative conversation. I appreciated the presentations, and I do think this is a good basis for member states and stakeholders to start thinking about what should be captured when we guide or when we make a proposal on operating principles as an outcome of our process. So I hope that all participants have the same feelings. There may be further questions. As Jacqueline indicated, no problem to reach out to the Secretariat, but I think there's also another opportunity to share your views through written submissions after this webinar that could also help inform the Secretariat in further finalizing the document for our discussions. So with that, I hand it back to you, Jacqueline, and thank you for a very good session.
Yes, big thanks to you, Gudi, for being with us and for all the panelists today. Very experienced with a lot of things to share. This for sure will not be the last time we will ask your help and contributions to our process. So stay tuned with us. Diana, over to you in case you have any final logistics or comments. If not, we are closing the session, the webinar today.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and thank you to all the speakers who join us today, representing the different science policy panels that exist. We would like to bring to your attention that the next event of this series will take place next week already on the 2nd of May. It's a side event to the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions Conference of the Parties. 2nd of May at 1:15 p.m. For those who are registered to attend the Conference of the Parties, you can join us in the room. For the others, please join us online. Also bring to your attention that as we will be at the Conference of the Parties of the Conventions in the next 2 weeks, we are also co-organizing 2 other events that you can see here on the screen, and you will find more information on our website. And then moving on, I would also like to mention that tomorrow, another important process that is also linked to what we have been discussing today is the Plastic Pollution International Negotiating Committee that is meeting in Paris at the end of May. We are hosting tomorrow a briefing session on, it's an hybrid event on the preparations for INC2. You are also welcome to join us for that event, and we are the colleagues from the Open and Working Group Secretariat. We also be present in Paris, and we'll make the links that are needed between this process that we have discussed today and the INC2 process. So with that, we once more thank you very much for the attendees who stayed with us until now. And to the panelists who join us from various parts of the world today. And we look forward to have you back at our upcoming events. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.